Coming up on this special edition of Newsline, we get you set for the 2020 Democratic Presidential Convention as the Democrats prepare to nominate former Vice President Joe Biden.
Folks, it's not sufficient to build back. We have to build back better. That's what my plan is, to build back better.
Along with Vice Presidential candidate and California Senator Kamala Harris.
Everything we care about, our economy, our health, our children, the kind of country we live in. It's all on the line.
WRHU reporters have the convention covered from all sides, including the impact of the coronavirus pandemic, the civil rights protests, how Bernie Sanders is affecting the Democratic platform, and much more. Here are your hosts, Lauren Brill and Danielle Kosick.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our special coverage of the Democratic National Convention here on 88.7 FM, Radio Hofstra University. I'm Lauren Brill.
And I'm Danielle Kosick. The conventions are more than just a collection of speeches. They're a chance for each major party to solidify their platform and launch the final leg of campaigning before Election Day. This year's conventions are especially unique. They are being held virtually because of the coronavirus pandemic. All speeches will be made at the Democratic Convention will be done over Zoom, including presumptive nominee Joe Biden's acceptance speech. Officially, the conventions are delegates from each state, chosen based on the results of the primary elections and caucuses, coming together to formally nominate their party's candidate for president. For the Republicans, there was never a doubt over who their candidate for president would be. President Donald Trump did not face any serious challengers, and some states did not hold Republican primaries because no other candidates qualified to be on their ballot.
The Democrats began this election cycle with a crowded field. Vermont Senator and self-described Democrat socialist Bernie Sanders was the frontrunner early in the race, finishing second in the first-in-the-nation Iowa caucuses, before wins in New Hampshire and Nevada. Primaries shifted when former Vice President Joe Biden earned a convincing win in South Carolina. On the eve of Super Tuesday in March, when more than a third of the delegates are allocated, more moderate candidates, including Minnesota Senator Amy Klobuchar and South Bend, Indiana Mayor Pete Buttigieg, suspended their campaigns and endorsed Biden. Former New York City Mayor Mike Bloomberg and Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren dropped out later that week. Sanders continued his campaign into April, but Biden picked up wins in Florida, Michigan, and Wisconsin, which will be key swing states come November. And with the country's focus shifting from the presidential primaries to the COVID-19 pandemic, Sanders suspended his campaign, leaving Biden as a presumptive nominee. WRHU reporter Natalie Kate has more about the official functions of the conventions and why they are still important this year.
That was sound of the 1952 Republican Convention, which was the first political convention to be televised live coast to coast. For years, conventions have been a vital part of presidential elections and gives voters a look at what each candidate and party will stand for. The first presidential convention was the 1832 Democratic Convention. I had the chance to speak to political science professor Rosanna Perotti about the history of conventions and what makes this convention different from the rest. Perotti first explained what the point of conventions are.
So the main practical purposes of conventions are to adopt a platform, to make it clear, therefore, that what the party stands for, and secondly, to make sure that the party has coalesced around that one nominee after, a process where there have been several candidates vying to become the nominee. So, it's a time for the party to really rally around its nominee, to introduce that nominee to the potential electorate out there for November.
She then went on to say that this year's convention is important because the election is so unique.
Rarely do we have an opportunity to choose between two different paths for our country and two different styles of candidates amid a historic crisis, and indeed a set of historic crises. And what do I mean by a set of historic crises? The challenge of the pandemic, the challenge of all the social divisions created as a result of our history of slavery, all that coming up to the surface because of demographic change in our country, and finally, a third crisis, the threat that our country and our planet faces because of climate change and continued weather, emergencies.
Besides this convention, Parati says that the 1968 Democratic Convention was also one like no other.
It was a convention that was marked by discord, both inside of the convention facility and outside in the streets. Inside, the Democratic Party was really, there's a lot of discord in the party about the rules of choosing delegates and seating delegates. And outside of the convention, there was a great deal of unrest. There were lots of protesters in the street, many of them young Democrats who were trying to get a voice in the party.
Due to the pandemic, many events have been moved virtually, and no fans will be allowed at the in-person events. Democratic nominee Joe Biden has already said he'll be accepting his nomination from his home in Delaware. Parati says that not having fans and in-person events makes it harder for voters to get excited about each nominee.
The function of getting people excited about the candidate, about the nominee, may kind of fall flat. Other methods may be necessary to make people excited about the nominee than streaming a lot of speeches. And those are, really, I'm sure, run the gamut from reaching people online, online meaning through social media and texting in order to mobilize them to want to come out and vote for this person.
This election has seen many twists and turns throughout the year, so this convention will be one for the history books. Thank you again to political science professor Rosanna Parati for taking the time to speak with me. Reporting for WRHU, I'm Natalie Kate.
Thank you, Natalie, for that report. As was mentioned, the 1968 Democratic Convention is one of the more historically significant ones. Like today, 1968 was a year of civil unrest and division over continuing U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. WRHU's Adam Flash spoke with Hofstra history professor Carolyn Eisenberg about what made the 1968 Democratic Convention so contentious and how it compares to today.
The 2020 presidential race is taking place in a year like no other. However, over half a century ago, a race surrounding similar events and ideas occurred in 1968. It was a year marked heavily by the civil rights movement and protests against the Vietnam War. I spoke with Hofstra history professor Carolyn Eisenberg about the difference between the years. She says in the months leading up to the 1968 election, many Democratic candidates dropping out marked an important turn in the race.
If you looked at this race, let's say as of March of 1968 or April of 1968, you had candidates who really were posing an alternative to Richard Nixon, both in terms of the Vietnam War and even in terms of domestic things. But as you know, those challenges essentially disappeared by the time you're in the summer. So when you get to the point where you have Hubert Humphrey running as the Democratic candidate, at that time he didn't seem to be a significant alternative. Right now, that's very different. Because the difference is we're in our fourth year of President Trump. And Joe Biden is running in a context where we have had a disastrous 4 years.
Eisenberg says some voters this year are looking for an alternative to President Trump and believe Joe Biden is a viable option.
The core difference is we're coming out of this experience of the Trump presidency. And so to some extent, anybody that was running for the presidency right now who gave signs of knowing things, not being ignorant, having a mentally healthy approach to things that doesn't lie all the time. I mean, whoever would fill that bill is a very important alternative.
Amidst protests against police brutality and racial inequality this year, President Trump has called for law and order. In '68, Nixon used the same phrase, although his presidency was quite different than Trump's.
His program domestically was not that conservative. He used the phrase, law and order, But in terms of what did that translate into programmatically, not that much. Many people make the point that Richard Nixon was our last liberal president. But programmatically, Nixon didn't run with a lot of programs that would be anti-civil rights. And as the president of the United States, he wasn't really that interested in reversing it, which is really different. I mean, Trump puts these people in charge who hate the government, hate the agencies, happy to mess up anything. There's no sense of institutional respect that the Trump people have.
To Eisenberg, Trump is a much larger issue than Nixon ever was.
Richard Nixon was nowhere near as threatening a figure as Donald Trump is.
An election is shaped by the current events surrounding it. Both 1968 and 2020 have been marked by huge efforts towards civil rights. Just like those of today, marches, protests, and rallies in the 60s were working to bring awareness to larger societal issues.
What starts to happen in the latter part of the 60s is that civil rights organizing moves north, so that leaders of the civil rights movement are beginning to say, no, the problem isn't just Jim Crow laws, the problem isn't just disenfranchisement, right? But if we look at the profound inequality in the North, that has to do with a whole set of discriminatory policies.
Just as the frustration over a lack of change grew following the death of George Floyd, protesters in the 60s faced a similar phenomenon as their efforts faced opposition as they moved north.
The kinds of gains that they are able to make in the South are not replicated. To a significant degree, campaigns are not getting the kind of dramatic results that could be seen elsewhere. And so the consequence of that is that the rage inside the Black community is growing. And it's in that context that you're getting race riots.
While the civil rights movement saw both violent and nonviolent forms of protesting, this year's marches remain overwhelmingly peaceful.
The attitude of the protesters in most cities that we're seeing is with a pretty strong commitment to nonviolence.
As protests continue nationwide, Eisenberg says President Trump is hoping to spin it negatively and use it to his advantage in the election.
Trump is trying very hard to tell people, look what's happening, they're destroying our cities, they're far left Democrats, love riots, right? But he's hoping that he can get some anger going about all of that to help his candidacy.
Just as the youth led the way to protest against the Vietnam War and for civil rights both then and now, Eisenberg believes it's essential young people get involved and show up to vote in November.
As we go into these last months of the election, it's absolutely crucial that young people get involved.
Reporting for WRHU, I'm Adam Flash.
Our thanks to Adam for that report. A big part of the conventions are speeches by the presidential and vice presidential nominee, other party leaders, and people who represent the party's platform. We're now joined by convention speech expert and communications professor at Boston University, Dr. Tammy Vigil. Dr. Vigil, thank you for speaking with us.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, in what ways do convention speeches impact who people vote for?
Well, it's hard to particularly point to a speech and say it moved so many votes. Instead, what it does, the speeches as a whole start to create themes and platforms for the party and start to differentiate, well, not start to, but they differentiate the parties and also the candidates in a more concrete kind of way. All of the speeches provide opportunities for listeners to get to know both the candidates and what they stand for in a deeper kind of way than sometimes advertisements might do or other kinds of rhetoric from the campaigns. So I can't really say like it moves 45% of people, but it does impact people's perceptions broadly.
Yeah, and then according to a New York Times report, some speakers will have just 2 minutes to deliver their address. How can a speech be written so that it's still impactful, even if it has to be shorter?
Well, actually, short speeches are probably a little bit, I wouldn't say easier to write, but they're a lot easier to remember. So if you write a good 2-minute speech, more of it will probably show up on YouTube and get retweeted or get turned into sound bites than sometimes a longer speech where there are multiple things that people just have to sort of pick and choose from. So you get an opportunity to actually have a nice, concise and distilled argument or claim. And so I think that that actually might be more helpful to some folks. Oftentimes we get politicians who tend to ramble and then they get themselves in trouble when they do that. So the 2-minute speech is actually probably going to be a lot more effective than, say, the 15-minute speech for some of these speakers. Obviously, they gave the longer spots to people who have more experience and who are known for having better speeches, like, for example, Michelle Obama, who is really well known for giving excellent convention speeches, very memorable ones. So she gets more time. Folks who are newer or younger, or maybe they want to just sort of let them have a moment to really give a message, but have it be concise, those folks will get the 2 minutes.
And so you're an expert in women as political commentators. Biden has selected Kamala Harris as the vice presidential candidate. What tone do you expect her to strike in her convention speech?
Well, she's the first African American and East Asian American woman. I think her tone will be interesting because she's going to have the bit of the gender issue that often comes in with women as candidates, and that is that they have to sort of strike the balance between being being an authority, and also not sounding like they're being too bossy, right? Because unfortunately, women have to face that gender restriction. That they have to try to balance these two. They don't want to come off as being the bossy woman or the pushy broad, and they don't want to come off as being the weak-willed person either. And so she's going to have to sort of strike a middle ground on that. She's usually pretty good, although she leans a little harder toward being more assertive than a lot of people like. I tend to like it a lot, but that's just me. So. And I think she's, traditionally vice presidential candidates are attack dogs. That's what people refer to them as in campaigns. And so she might be a lot more assertive against Trump than, say, Biden might.
Dr. Vigil, thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, sure. It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Our thanks to Boston University Communications Professor Tammy Vigil. New York State Democratic Committee Chairman Jay Jacobs held a press briefing discussing preparations for the convention in regards to Biden's speech. Jacobs says the presumptive nominee needs to provide Americans with a path forward.
I think, as with any presidential candidate, the challenge is to let the American people know, what you have in store for them. What is your vision? What will America be like after 4 years of a Biden administration? And what do you hope to accomplish along the way? I think he's got to inspire Americans. I think the message has got to be a lot more than, I'm not Donald Trump. And I think he knows that. And I think that's an easy lift for him because he's lived these issues and these ideals for a very long time. I think he's going to demonstrate to the American people the difference, not just in substance, but in style, class, dignity. And I think that he's going to be setting out the marker for what this campaign will be all about.
Jacobs says Democrats see an opportunity to bring in voters who previously supported other parties.
That's a central theme to the campaign because we're going to be attracting not just Democrats, of course, and motivating Democrats, but we're going to be attracting independent voters as well as Republican voters who are fed up and sick and tired of the Trump administration.
He adds now is not the time to vote strictly along party lines.
We're all Americans first. We're Democrats or Republicans, progressives or moderates, or even conservatives way after that. If there is something more important than being an American, I don't know what it is in this country.
As we have been reporting over the past few months, there have been widespread civil rights protests this year on a level not seen since the civil rights movement of the 1960s. This year, protests were sparked following the death of George Floyd, an unarmed Black man, at the hands of Minneapolis police. Surveillance video showed a police officer kneeling on Floyd's neck for nearly 8 minutes. That former officer is now facing murder charges. Demonstrators across the country have called for an end to police violence, reallocation of funding and resources away from police and into schools, mental health programs, and other community services. On the Republican side, Donald Trump has opposed changes to policing and has said he is the law and order president. Joe Biden has voiced support for some police reforms and has unveiled an economic plan meant to address inequality. I spoke with Hofstra professor Tamika Robinson to hear more about how the civil rights protests will impact this year's conventions. The current civil rights protests and calls for police reform have been prominent in today's society following the death of George Floyd. I spoke to Dr. Tamika Robinson, Hofstra's Associate Professor of Rhetoric and Public Advocacy and Director of Speech and Debate, about how the ongoing protests and focus on police brutality may impact this year's conventions. Dr. Robinson does not expect President Trump to give attention to the ongoing protests at the Republican convention.
I think that if there is any reference, it'll be a passing reference, and it'll be more about enforcing law and order and the necessity for governments to step in and control the protest. But as far as directly engaging with the calls for reform that the protesters are asking for, I don't foresee any of that because President Trump has been quite unresponsive thus far to even addressing the concerns that the protesters have brought up. He's had many opportunities to address the calls that are there, and instead has called the Black Lives Matter movement as a whole hate speech. He's condemned the protesters and is not really willing to address what's there. And so unfortunately, I don't see that moment of unification coming during the RNC. I remain hopeful that he will do it at some point, but there's no evidence to suggest that he's going to do anything besides continue condemning this, because it plays well to his base. His base would like to believe that rhetoric, whether it's true or not.
However, looking towards the Democratic convention, Dr. Robinson predicts former Vice President Biden will comment on the ongoing protests as well as police brutality in order to win over the voters.
I think that we are going to see the DNC convention actually addressing some of it and really using it as a moment to build that momentum and to really talk about how as a country we can come together and really unite around some of these issues and deal with some of the issues that have been brought forth in the last few months. My projection is that he will try to really address the root reasons why people are there. So talking about some of the issues, not necessarily all of the issues that have been brought forth, but some of the issues dealing with police reform, police brutality, and a recognition of there needing to be some systematic restructuring, I think will come up during the DNC convention, because that, again, is a way to try to win over voters who are on the streets and protesting or support the protesters in any way.
We can expect to see protests at both conventions, but Dr. Robinson predicts that they will be peaceful.
Even during the Democratic debates during the primary, there were protesters of Vice President Biden that talked about his deportation policies when he was vice president within the Obama administration. So I think you still will see some of that is going to occur during the DNC, and calls for the DNC to actually address some of the policy proposals and the ideas that the protesters have put forward. So I think that you will see some of that on both sides and at both conventions. But as far as a expectation of violence at either of them, I think that really comes down to how police actually respond to what's happening.
Trump released an ad in July falsely suggesting Biden supports defunding the police.
Is purposefully distorting the actual proposal that Vice President Biden has put forward in order to make it easier to argue against. That's a logical fallacy. And people who recognize that as such is not going to be persuaded by that type of logic. Does it work for some people? Yes, because they already want to believe that. So reductions in the overall budgets and stuff of police departments is not the exact same thing as completely disbanding funding police departments.
Dr. Robinson predicts he will not directly engage with Trump's claims, but he will explain his policies.
Going through, here's what the actual plan is, here's what it looks like, building some of that momentum, which is the purpose of the convention, is getting people excited about the candidate, is a better use of his time, because his policy isn't what President Trump is trying to argue that it is.
For WRHU, I'm Lauren Brill.
Thank you, Lauren, for that report. 2020 is a landmark year for another group of people who have had to fight for equal rights. In 1920, the 19th Amendment was ratified, which gave women the right to vote. WRHU's Eli Finkelson takes a look back at the struggle for women to get the right to vote and challenges faced by women in politics today.
This year is an especially historical election, not just because of the hyper-polarized political climate, but because 2020 is the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, granting women, specifically white women, the right to vote. I spoke with two women who are experts on the subject, Professor of Women's Studies Lisa Merrill and Political Science Professor Mina Bose. Professor Merrill gave me some background on the women's suffrage movement, specifically an important piece of how the movement was formed.
Actually, what we consider the suffrage movement grew in the U.S. out of the movement to abolish enslavement. And it didn't end with the 19th Amendment in August of 1920, because the Black women, who had always been a crucial part of attempting to get the vote, even though the white women's movement didn't always, often very much discriminated against them, continued to have difficulty voting.
Professor Bose pointed out how far we have come since then, enamored by how many women ran for office this year.
The number of finalists with such a diversity of credentials, from working in the National Security Council to expertise in Congress to serving in the police department, have a career in the police force before entering Congress. Such a wealth of contributions that women are making in American politics today. And I think that it is important, and as we celebrate the centennial of the 19th Amendment, that we look at that we recognize how much women contribute to the democratic process. And I would certainly say having the Democrats nominate their second woman vice presidential nominee, first person of color, African American, Indian, is really highly significant, and is it's important to recognize in this year.
Professor Merrill again gave context, explaining the different women, white and of color, who were crucial to the fight to vote.
So, Black woman organizer Frances Ellen Watkins Harper in 1866 spoke at the 11th National Women's Rights Convention. People generally know Sojourner Truth and her important speech in 1851, but Harper was speaking specifically about voting. And then in 1872, Susan B. Anthony was arrested for voting. And in the same year, Victoria Woodhull decided she was going to run for president, even though women couldn't vote. Shirley Chisholm talking in 1972, and Victoria Woodhull running for president in 1872. And in an earlier presidential election, some of Frances Ellen Watkins Harper's speeches. So, I just think when we talk about the suffrage movement, it's so important to look at that in light of all of the things that were happening at the same time. Sometimes the people whose names we know but we don't associate with suffrage, like Harriet Tubman, and her amazing work on the Underground Railroad. But she also helped found the National Association of Colored Women, and they were fighting for the right to vote. And Ida B. Wells Barnett, we know for anti-lynching work, but she was part of Black women's suffrage organization.
Both professors were in agreement that there are certain challenges that women face in certain fields that men do not.
when you look at women who run for political office, women tend to be more hesitant than men, are more likely to say, I'm not qualified, I'm not ready, are less likely to, are less comfortable with fundraising. That's why you see organizations like Emily's List, right, that were created to really to fund women and then to encourage their participation. And there are numerous other organizations. That's kind of one of the classic ones, the fundraising organizations to bring women into politics. And I think there's it's not to say that women alone have these characteristics. There's certainly men who hesitate to run as well. But over time, patterns, what we have seen is that women tend to be more reticent about running and fundraising. And I think that's when you look at the 2020 Democratic presidential candidates and the number of women who were competing 1 year ago, you can see that has changed significantly. Looking at Senator Harrison's campaign, Senator Warren's campaign, right? Senator Klobuchar, so in New Hampshire, we're seeing women taking, really becoming vocal and competitive leaders in national politics, and I think that's an important change in 2020.
I think what we see again today, in timely news questions, right? The ability to be taken seriously and be assertive. There's a double bind for women when women communicate, power and expertise. It's a double bind. So some of the challenges are to be just taken seriously as a person, to have one's abilities recognized and not patronized or diminished in any way, not interrupted or silenced or ridiculed. And, that obviously goes back hundreds and hundreds of years. And that sense of, heteropatriarchy that does not see the speaking, the active presence, speech, embodied agency of women as significant, as equal, as just human, but bifurcates that and diminishes it, affects women in every field, but certainly in political fields.
However, as Professor Bose explained to me, politics is all about perspective, and women bring in new ideas and perspectives that are needed to create a well-rounded government.
We could go into a lot of specifics about the women's vote and the gender gap on certain issues, particularly issues of military intervention, for example. But I think what's really more important at this point is not to say that there are women's issues per se, but that women in elected office and women in politics bring a perspective that previously was not seriously engaged.
Professor Merrill summed up the importance of the women's right to vote by taking the time to think about everyone who has fought for everyone's voices to be heard.
It is so crucial when you think about all the people who have lost their lives for voting. I think it's all of our lives on the line sometimes when we think about this issue, and people tend to take for granted the importance of suffrage. Issues that are historical always give us, more light on our present day. And I think the more we know about the historic fight for suffrage, for equality, just for human rights, and particularly human rights that take into consideration the way people of color have been denied those rights globally. This is the moment to see how important those votes are.
Thank you to Women's Studies Professor Lisa Merrill and Political Science Professor Mina Bose for speaking with me. For WRHU News, I'm Eli Finkelson.
Our thanks to Eli for that report. Along with the civil rights protests, the coronavirus pandemic has also dominated the news cycle for the past 5 months. COVID-19 has caused governments around the world to close non-essential businesses and schools, as health experts recommend people avoid close contact with others. The Democratic convention was originally supposed to be held in Milwaukee in June, but was postponed until this week because of COVID-19. All speeches are being done virtually, and Joe Biden will accept the nomination later this week from his home in Delaware. The pandemic has changed many aspects of daily life, including political campaigning. WRHU's Kate O'Brien reports on how political candidates have had to change the way they connect with voters because of COVID-19.
Today I'm announcing my candidacy for President of the United States.
I am officially running for President of the United States, and we are going to make our country great again.
A lot has changed since Joe Biden and Donald Trump announced their respective candidacies for president. A global pandemic has caused state and local officials to put limits on large gatherings to slow the spread of COVID-19. As a result, campaigning in this election cycle looks a little different from previous years. I spoke with director of the Calico Center for the American Presidency at Hofstra University, Dr. Mina Bose, about campaigning during the coronavirus pandemic and the effects this has had on the Democratic and Republican national conventions. Dr. Bose explained the period of campaigning before the conventions usually is a celebration of the nominee and a time for organizing the party.
They've become a time for building party unity, rallying the party faithful, energizing the grassroots in the party to prepare for the general election season.
This year, this time of celebration and preparation has become mostly virtual.
The retail politics, the travel, the grassroots cultivation of support and energy has all disappeared. There was very little travel in the spring. In the summer, we have seen both President Trump and the presumptive Democratic nominee, Joe Biden, make some trips. By and large, both the president and the challenger, Joe Biden, have had to campaign virtually.
While she wouldn't say there are any advantages to this type of campaigning, Dr. Bose says Biden and Trump's campaign teams have had to target their messages more deliberately.
Virtual campaigns require very clear public messages. And so that perhaps the emphasis on public communication, on either speaking or electronic communications, digital communications, those have become more pronounced in their importance.
Even though Trump has incumbency advantages, that doesn't mean he is free from campaigning issues, especially when the media is involved.
Being president certainly brings the advantage of visibility if that resource is used well and if visibility is helpful. When there's not good news, then the president can be it may bring more opportunity for the president to be blamed, right, or be seen as responsible for what's going on. So I would say it's kind of a double-edged sword.
Dr. Bose says Biden has to work harder to present himself to the public.
Joe Biden needs to be out on the campaign trail. He needs to, and the virtual campaign trail, right, needs to show that he is building up support, that he is energizing the party to the best degree possible, particularly, I think, given concerns about age and the large number of Democratic competitors 1 year ago for the nomination.
With the significant changes to the conventions this year, do they even matter? Dr. Bose says absolutely.
They do mark this transition from the nominating period to the general election campaign. The party platform, right, that is confirmed, although there's a big gulf between what the platform says and what policies result, but that does indicate what the agenda will be. The intra-party battles, right, how those are going to be resolved, they represent what the party's general election stance will be. And I would say that both Biden's and Trump's speeches are going to be highly significant for how the general election campaign will be waged in the fall.
As we approach Election Day in November, Dr. Bose says there are some important things voters should pay attention to.
We'll certainly see the rollout of campaign ads that are going to be highly significant for getting out the vote, right, for trying to mobilize, voter mobilization. You'll have the presidential debate and the vice presidential debate. And I think you're going to see a lot of attention to this question of absentee voting.
Will the pandemic have long-term impacts on how campaigning works? Dr. Bose thinks a push to go back to normal is more likely.
I would be surprised to see significant changes. I think the desire will certainly be to return to retail politics and being on the campaign, on the road to the White House, the actual road, not the virtual road, as much as possible.
Thank you again to Dr. Mina Bose for speaking with me. Reporting for WRHU News, I'm Kate O'Brien.
Thank you, Kate, for that report. Minority communities, including Latinas and Latinos, have been disproportionately impacted by the coronavirus pandemic and its economic consequences. They have also been highly politicized by President Trump, who has called for a crackdown on undocumented immigrants and has dehumanized Hispanics and Latinos in his rhetoric. The Latinx community is becoming an increasingly powerful voting bloc. According to the grassroots organization Voto Latino, 32 million Latinas and Latinos are eligible to vote this year, and there is currently a record number of Latinos and Latinas in Congress. WRHU reporter Jason Siegel talked to Jared Nordland, a senior strategist and Florida State Director of the nonpartisan organization Unidos US, about how the coronavirus is affecting voter attitudes amidst the Latinx community and what they are looking for in a political candidate.
They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people.
That was then candidate Donald Trump while campaigning for president in 2016, giving a negative portrayal of Mexicans without providing any evidence for his claims. Hispanics and Latinos have been thrust into the center of political discourse in the United States during Trump's presidency, and in a few months, they will have a chance to make their voices heard on Election Day. I spoke with Jared Nordland, a senior strategist and Florida State Director for Unidos US, a nonpartisan organization that serves the Latinx community. Nordland says Trump's rhetoric and actions, such as trying to eliminate the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, will make it difficult for him to win a significant number of votes from the Latinx community as he prepares to be nominated for a second term.
I think ultimately, if President Trump wants the Latino vote, he's got to make sure that his rhetoric meets his actions, and that he's actually trying to do things that actually will court Latino voters. And I think there's been a pretty strong rash that he's not been doing that. But I mean, ultimately, people are going to see what his record is, and unlike 2016, he has a record now, and so people will take that into consideration.
Nordland says political candidates need to learn about what is important to the Latinx community in order to earn their vote.
Whoever wins the Latino vote, whether it be in a state or the country, it's going to come down to them ability to actually connect with the community, understand what the issues are, and actually have solutions that actually help the community out, make sure that they have every opportunity out there to live the American dream that everybody else has.
He adds politicians need to follow through on their plans to help the community and continue to work on issues important to Latinos and Latinas after the election.
The biggest thing is actually spending time in the community, not doing the photo ops. The photo ops, people are really aware of those, that there's photo ops and that is meant for some campaign stuff, and then people leave, and that's people are aware of that now. What they really want to have is people have meaningful dialogue with them in the community, and the more time they spend in the community, you're going to see that votes will shift towards that candidate who spends more time in the community versus one who doesn't do that. Making sure that after election day, you don't leave, because that's where a lot of people do, is that they get to election day, they get the votes they need to win, and then all of a sudden they're gone. The community also sees that a lot.
The presidential convention signaled the beginning of the final stages of the lead up to the election. As voting day approaches, Nordland encourages people to take this time to make sure they're able to vote and learn more about the issues important to them.
The biggest thing that people can do is one is, if you're not registered to vote, register to vote. If you're eligible to do that, please do that. Two is get educated on the issues and the process.
He says the Latinx community should work together and encourage others to vote.
Making sure you know what's at stake in terms of also, why you want to go vote this year. And then once you've got a plan to go vote and you're going to vote here, get your friends and your family members to do the exact same thing. Because all the elections are about numbers, and having people turn out in larger numbers, you make sure that people hear our community more and more louder.
This year's conventions and election are different because of the coronavirus pandemic. Nordland says voters should understand how mail-in voting works if that's how they plan to cast their ballot.
If you're going to be changing the way you would normally vote, so if you want to vote by mail or vote earlier than you haven't done in the past. Make sure you read your state, your county's rules around that. Know what is required of you to do that, because vote by mail laws and early vote laws are different by county and different by state. And it's important that you learn what those rules are, make sure that your vote will ultimately count on election day.
The pandemic is expected to play a big factor in how the Latinx population votes, because they have disproportionately felt both the health and economic effects.
It's about COVID-19 and either the state or the federal response to COVID-19. We're seeing unemployment rates go really high in places that are heavily on tourism. I'm based in Orlando, Florida, and in our counties that are heavily Latino, unemployment rate here is in the 15-20% range. So it's above the actual national average. Making sure that people are able to get tested, they're able to get the help they need if they are COVID positive, and making sure that in the meantime, as they're trying to recover the economy, that they're not having to decide between getting coverage and figuring out how to put food on the table or pay for their rent, or worrying about getting evicted.
According to the grassroots political organization Voto Latino, 32 million members of the Latinx population will be eligible to vote this year. Nordland says Latinx voters will have a significant impact on the 2020 election.
Especially in places like Florida and Texas and California, where about half the Latino population lives, you're seeing their weight in terms of votes increasing, where a lot of times the community as a whole has the ability to really shape the ultimate outcome of the election. And so having that ability to ultimately influence the outcome of the election is definitely a reason for people to go out and vote, make sure their voices are heard come this fall. So that way, when we come in governing next year, issues that are impacting Latinos are going to be addressed, and they'll have people in their local governments to actually reflect their issues.
There is also currently a record number of Latinx members of Congress, with 40 representatives and 4 senators. Nordland says it's important for the Latinx population to get involved in the political process in order to make meaningful change for their communities.
When we're seeing more and more Latinos in Congress, we're also seeing that people are advocating on behalf of our community because they're from our community. And so as the country is becoming more and more diverse, we're hoping to have the ranks increase so that there is the reflection of the community as we see across the United States that we see in Congress. And so we're hoping that with that becomes better laws that address our issues out there.
Reporting for WRHU, I'm Jason Siegel.
To Jason for that report. We now shift to look more specifically at this year's Democratic ticket. Presumptive Democratic nominee Joe Biden's selection for vice president was historic. He has chosen California Senator Kamala Harris, first woman of Black and Indian heritage, to serve as vice president. I spoke with Hofstra political science professor Richard Himmelfarb about the significance of Biden selecting Harris as his running mate. Former Vice President Joe Biden has selected Senator of California Kamala Harris to be his running mate in the upcoming election. In March, Biden previously stated that he would choose a woman to join him on the Democratic ticket, limiting the options of who would stand beside him. Hofstra political science professor Richard Himmelfarb shared his opinions on the matter.
Well, I think he had, in a way, boxed himself into a corner, because he had said he would choose a woman, and then he had basically pressure arose for him to choose a woman of color, and so he had limited choices.
Following the recent civil rights movement, it also became clear that Biden would likely choose a woman of color.
At some level, appeases people in the party, particularly who were demanding that he choose a woman of color to run with him.
But in the primaries, Harris lost a lot of votes to Biden when it came to Black voters.
She really didn't acquit herself particularly well. She really had an extraordinarily difficult time gaining traction among African Americans, who are exactly the group she's supposed to appeal to.
Harris had also been known to share negative opinions of her now running mate during the primary election.
Senator Harris, during the campaign for the nomination, basically called Biden a racist. She basically said Biden was a racist. Then there was a woman who was accusing Biden of sexual harassment, and she said she believed the woman who accused him of sexual harassment. It's really kind of crazy when you think about it that Biden chose for his running mate, a woman who basically questioned his character.
Although it is not uncommon for running mates to disagree on some issues, these were more personal statements.
There's a long history of running mates for people who've been chosen for the vice presidential nomination disagreeing with the person who nominated them on substantive issues.
It's been a while since we had a vice president who overshadows the president, but Himmelfarb thinks Harris will do just that.
In choosing her, he's chosen somebody who is probably going to, at some level, overshadow him, which is interesting. I don't know that we've had that for a long time, where you've had a vice presidential candidate who really has overshadowed her presidential candidate in charisma.
It will overall be interesting to see how she takes on the role.
And it'll be interesting to see how she does on the national stage, because I think with Biden taking a low profile, I think that she's going to be much more front and center than you're going to see of a typical vice presidential candidate. And she's going to have to answer a lot of questions.
For WRHU, I'm Danielle Kosick.
Thank you, Danielle, for that report. As we mentioned earlier, it was not clear from the beginning that Joe Biden would be the Democratic nominee. Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders emerged as the frontrunner after strong showings in the first three contests in Iowa, New Hampshire, and Nevada. Biden gained momentum after a convincing win in South Carolina, and Sanders dropped out in April as Biden took the lead in the delegate count, and the coronavirus pandemic began taking a devastating toll on the U.S. Even though Sanders is not the presidential nominee, he will still have a major impact on the Democratic platform as Biden attempts to win support from Sanders' backers. WRHU reporter Courtney Ingalls spoke with Hofstra history professor Rosanna Parati about how Bernie Sanders is still playing a role in the convention and the Democratic Party, despite not being the nominee.
Senator Bernie Sanders has played a significant role in government throughout the last few years, becoming one of the most supported senators to Democratic voters. Sanders has been winning over Democrats since his first try for presidency in 2016. Political science professor at Hofstra University, Rosanna Parati, says Sanders is still continuing to influence the Democratic platform even after his two failed presidential runs.
Sanders is making an impact in so many ways, and ways that are less obvious to ordinary, Americans, and that don't deal directly with the agenda and the platform. I mean, certainly he has almost single-handedly caused the agenda to steer to the left, but also Sanders has provided a lesson to the Biden campaign and to the rest of the party about outreach to young people, and not a lot of people think about this, but to Latinos.
Sanders has not only influenced voters, but he has also influenced and endorsed many government officials.
He also has affected the choice and the recruitment of other candidates for office. I mean, we can't forget that he has supported and endorsed Ayanna Pressley, a member of the House from Massachusetts, Cori Bush from Missouri, Rohana from California, Rashida Tlaib, and of course, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, New York. All those people are in politics and in office with the help and the endorsement of Bernie Sanders.
Back in 2016, some of Bernie's ideas and platforms seemed too radical to people in the Democratic Party for a few reasons.
Bernie Sanders is a populist candidate, and it's not surprising that a lot of people who supported Sanders in the primaries in 2016 ultimately voted for Donald Trump. He is an unapologetic advocate of the little guy, of the working class. And it's, some may consider that radical. Others consider that absolutely essential to keep the working class in the Democratic Party.
Some of his policies include Medicare for all and to make college affordable for people in the working class. Parati believes that with the way the world is changing, many people are reconsidering Sanders' ideas.
These things may have been considered radical in 2016. They're not considered radical anymore, largely because of Sanders, but also because of how the demographics, first of all, how the demographics of our country are changing. And secondly, because of the effect that globalization has had on our economy. It's created an economy that is, as we all know, much more unequal, with the rich much richer and the poor much poorer. And the coronavirus has only bared that and made it worse.
Former Vice President Joe Biden is the presumptive Democratic candidate for the 2020 presidential election. Even though many voters wanted to see Sanders go against President Trump, they are still rallying behind Biden to make sure their voices are heard.
The Sanders supporters have organized themselves and sort of placed themselves behind the Biden campaign. Think now of just the recent mobilization of the WRHU.org, who acknowledged that, they really wanted Sanders for president, but it's more important for Democrats right now to push for progressive policies, regardless of the candidate, and are advocating for Biden for president. It's not just steering the agenda, but he has helped the party to put in place and to mobilize supporters and voters for upcoming elections, obviously including the presidential election.
Many of Sanders' supporters are made up of young people and minorities. In order for Biden to compete in the 2020 election, Parati says he is going to have to appeal to those groups as well.
What's going to be hard for Biden is to hang on to and to inspire and to mobilize the youth and Latinos, I think. And it would be wise for Biden to learn from Sanders how to modulate that message.
Although Sanders will not be seen on the presidential ballot, his ideas have influenced and impacted the Democratic Party. Parati hopes that some of Sanders' ideas will be carried through in our government in the future.
If the Democrats were to win the presidency and the Senate and the House, yes, they would. And there would be backlash against that. And so what Biden is going to have to do is to try and get as much of that agenda can. And it is a very difficult spot for Biden to be in because he faces pressure both from the progressive wing of his own party and the pressure of having to win over and keep the support of working class whites and of highly educated Republicans in the suburbs who will likely vote for a candidate who is more palatable to them than Trump.
Sanders' impact has also encouraged many to run for office that want to make change to our government.
There's absolutely no question that his campaign and his endorsements have inspired a whole generation of women and, for whatever reason, be it because they were kind of upset by the sort of Bernie bro spirit, or because they were inspired by Bernie's kind of outsider message. A whole group of all sorts of outsider candidates have come to run for public office. The demographics in the United States are changing, have been changing, and the roles of men and women in the United States have been changing for years. But our elected officials, the composition of our elected officials, indeed the composition of the higher-ups in both parties, has not reflected that change. And what Bernie Sanders has contributed massively to doing is to making elected officials, the composition of elected officials, and the party leadership in the United States look a lot more like the rest of the country.
Reporting for WRHU, I'm Courtney Ingalls.
Our thanks to Courtney for that report. That will do it for our special coverage of the 2020 Democratic National Convention. Our engineer this evening is Jason Siegel.
Tune in to Newsline later this week to hear special reports on the DACA program and a 30-year Secret Service veteran on police reform. Only here on your 3-time Marconi Award-winning radio station, 88.7 FM, Radio Hofstra University.
Reporting for WRHU, I'm Danielle Kosick.
And I'm Lauren Brill. Thanks for listening and have a great night.
Newsline is a presentation of Long Island's largest radio news team, comprised of nationally recognized student broadcasters, winners of numerous awards from the Associated Press, Society of Professional Journalists, Radio Television News Directors Association, Hearst Corporation, Long Island Press Club, and other prestigious organizations. Newsline is researched and produced by student journalists using the Hofstra News Hub, cutting-edge multimedia news gathering technology, located in Hofstra's School of Communication. To learn more about News Hub and the Hofstra School of Communication, log on to hofstra.edu. To learn more about News Hub and the Hofstra School of Communication, log on to WRHU.org.